The report is 47 pages long. I produced it over 11 days in October 2023, working from the dining table of our apartment on Sukhumvit Soi 31, while Sirawan was at her sister's in Phuket, which she was not. The report has a cover page, an executive summary, a chronological evidence section, a financial analysis, a conclusions section, and a recommendations section. It is formatted to the standard I developed at the National Crime Agency, where I spent 22 of my 30 years, and it cites 14 evidential exhibits, bank statements, phone records I had no right to but obtained anyway, with the skills I had been paid to develop on behalf of the Crown, messaging logs, the company registration documents for a business that should not have existed, and 3 photographs from a street in Surat Thani that I had no business being on. The report is the best professional work I have produced in my career. I have not shown it to anyone. I have not acted on it. It is in a folder on my laptop that I have looked at approximately once a week for the past 18 months, in the way a man looks at something he cannot put down and cannot use. And if you have been in a job that required you to produce evidence, you understand that evidence that produces no action is a specific kind of professional failure, and it is the failure I am living with. My name is Frank. I am 67, from Manchester, and I spent 30 years as a fraud examiner, 12 with the Greater Manchester Police Economic Crime Unit, and 22 with the National Crime Agency, which is the UK's organised crime investigative body, a job that required me to investigate complex financial fraud across international jurisdictions and to produce the quality of evidence that would hold in a Crown court. I need to give you the 30 years, because the 30 years are the engine of everything that follows, and I have not given them enough specificity yet. Economic crime investigation is a particular discipline. It requires patience of a kind that other investigative work does not. The patience of a man who is prepared to spend 4 months in a spreadsheet, tracking transaction patterns across 40 accounts in 3 jurisdictions, looking for the transfer that proves the scheme. Most fraud is not complex in its essential structure. Someone is taking money that is not theirs, using a mechanism designed to look legitimate, across a period they believe will not be examined. The skill is in the examination. The skill is in the willingness to read every line, because the line that breaks a case is always a line that looked like the other lines, and the only difference between the breaking line and the others is that someone read it carefully. Across 30 years, I read approximately 4 billion lines of financial data. I developed a capacity for pattern recognition that my colleagues sometimes described as alarming, and that I would describe as simply habitual. Anomalies in financial records feel different from their surroundings, in the way that a wrongly spelled word looks wrong before you have consciously registered the wrong letter. The pattern is visible below the level of deliberate attention. I walked into my own marriage with that capacity fully operational, and across 14 months of noticing, I did not open the file. That is the gap between the professional and the person, and that gap is what this recording is about. My name is Frank. I am 67, from Manchester, with a government pension of about £2,300 a month, and savings of £185,000. I had been twice divorced before Thailand, the first briefly in my 30s, the second ending in 2011, after 14 years, both times because a man who spends his career building cases for the Crown produces, at home, a version of himself that a domestic life cannot sustain indefinitely. I had known this about myself, and I had decided that knowing it was not the same as being able to change it. And I had come to Thailand in 2018, not to find anything, but to live somewhere warm, at a cost that my pension could sustain, and I had found Sirawan in a way that I am going to describe accurately, and that will sound, given everything else I have told you, either ironic or inevitable, and it is both. I want to give you Sirawan honestly, because she is the most intelligent person in this recording, and if I describe her as anything less, I am not being accurate. Let me give you Bangkok first, because the Bangkok context is relevant, and because it is the detail this genre most often omits. I arrived in Thailand in October 2018, with the government pension, and the savings, and the specific condition of a man who has spent 30 years being professionally suspicious, and who has concluded that this professional condition is, in domestic life, a liability. My 2 previous marriages ended not because I was cruel or unfaithful or absent, but because I was, according to both women at different points, exhausting. In the specific way that a man who notices everything and trusts nothing is exhausting when the noticing and the not trusting are directed at the people who share his kitchen. The first wife said she had the sense of being permanently evaluated. The second wife said that not being trusted by a fraud examiner was worse than not being trusted by an ordinary man, because an ordinary man's suspicion has the quality of irrationality, and a fraud examiner's suspicion has the quality of methodology. I understood both statements. I was not able to refute either. I retired from the second marriage in 2011 with a specific and accurate self-knowledge. I am a man who notices things and applies professional attention to his domestic environment, and this is a liability, and there is no version of me in which it is not. I had understood this since 2005, and I had not been able to change it. And Thailand represented, at 63, the decision to stop trying to be a different kind of man in an English domestic context, and to try a different domestic context with the man I was. I rented a serviced apartment on Sukhumvit Soi 13. I ate at the same 3 places in rotation. I walked in the evenings. I did not go to the bars, not because I had anything against bars, but because I had spent enough time in rooms full of men managing their evenings to know that I did not need more of that. I was, for the first 3 months, alone, and the aloneness was uncomplicated in a way I had not experienced since approximately 1992, and I found this restful, and I did not mistake restful for everything, and I was right not to. I want to give you Sirawan honestly, working in the events management department of the hotel where I was staying on Sukhumvit, while I looked for a longer-term rental. She was from Phuket originally, had studied hospitality management in Bangkok, had worked in hotel management for 15 years, and had risen, through the specific combination of competence and the ability to manage rooms full of difficult people that the hospitality industry requires, to a position of real authority. Her English was excellent, and her German was serviceable, and she spoke 3 Thai dialects, which is not common, and which is the product of either exceptional facility with language or extensive strategic effort, and both of those things are true of Sirawan. We met at the hotel breakfast, where she was managing a complaint from a German guest with the patience of a person who has been managing complaints from German guests for 15 years and who has developed a near-perfect performance of sympathy that does not cost her anything. I watched her do it. A fraud examiner watches how people perform, and what I saw that morning was a very skilled performance. That is the whole of the irony. I was watching correctly and drawing the wrong conclusion, which is that she was good at her job, which she was. And the being good at the job includes skills that are directly applicable to a marriage in ways I did not think through. We were married in July 2020, during a period when the pandemic had made everything feel provisional, and the provisional had a specific appeal for a 65-year-old man living alone in Bangkok, which I want to say without self-pity, because it is simply accurate. The marriage was not an emergency decision. We had been together for 16 months. I knew what I was doing, and what I was doing was deciding that the company of a particular person was worth the risk of being wrong, and I had been wrong before, and the wrongness had not killed me. She moved into the apartment on Sukhumvit Soi 31, and I want to give you the marriage as it actually was in the first 2 years, because this recording will not make any sense without the real version. She reorganized the kitchen the week she moved in, without asking, with the confidence of a person who has managed hotel operations and knows intuitively that a kitchen serves its occupants best when its layout reflects how they actually cook, rather than how they happen to put things away. The reorganization was correct. I have been using the kitchen as she left it for 4 years. She found, within 3 weeks, the 3 restaurants I had identified and improved on all 3 of them with 4 more, and the 7 together formed a reliable circuit that we used for the next 3 years. She read in the evenings. We had our evenings distributed by the specific and sustainable rhythm of 2 people who have found the distance they need from each other without discussion, which is the best measure of compatibility I know. Not the shared interests or the aligned values, but the instinctive calibration of how much space the other person needs. She needed quiet evenings, and I needed quiet evenings, and we had quiet evenings, two people reading in the same room, and that was, I will tell you directly, the happiest domestic arrangement of my 67 years. I am including this because the report exists in the context of those evenings and that kitchen, and the context does not invalidate the report, and the report does not invalidate the context, and the holding of both of those things at once is the condition I am in. We had what I would characterize, with professional precision, as a satisfactory marriage for approximately the first 2 years. The satisfaction was genuine, she was organized, which I valued. She was funny in the specific way of a person who has spent 15 years managing other people's expectations, and who has developed a private commentary on the distance between what people expect and what they receive. She cooked at a standard that I found restorative. She was interested in what I had done. She asked about cases, not the classified ones, but the general shape of financial investigation, and she listened to the answers with the attention of someone who is genuinely curious, and the genuineness of the curiosity was the thing I noted and that I should have examined more carefully, and that I did not examine at all. In September 2022, I retired officially from the consulting work I had been doing since the NCA, private sector fraud work, mostly for financial institutions, and the retirement produced a change in our daily texture that I want to describe accurately. A man who has worked for 45 years and who stops working has, suddenly, the time and proximity that a marriage at a distance of 12 working hours a day does not produce, and the marriage, examined at close range without the insulating structure of separate schedules, is a different thing from the marriage you have been living in. I do not mean that the closeness revealed problems. I mean that the closeness revealed detail, and detail, in a fraud examiner's training, is where cases begin. I began to notice things, not specific anomalies, not a single red flag that I could have named and documented at that stage, but the general texture of minor inconsistencies, the phone conversations that happened in the other room, the financial decisions that were explained in the summary but not in the detail, the social account that I was aware existed and that I had never seen, the occasional reference to a person whose name and role were never quite fixed in the context of who Sirawan knew and from where. I want to give you those 14 months in more detail, because they are the period that I am most accountable for and that I understand most poorly. A fraud examiner who notices early-stage anomalies in a case does not wait 14 months to open the file. The standard at the NCA was, if you see a pattern, you document what you see immediately, and you open a preliminary inquiry within 2 working days. The preliminary inquiry does not prejudge the outcome. It does not assume fraud. It does not assume innocence. It simply begins the systematic collection of information that will eventually allow a factual determination. I knew this standard. I trained people in this standard. I applied it in 40 major cases. In the 14 months between the first inconsistency and the opening of the file, I applied it to nothing. I noticed, I marked for follow-up, and I did not follow up, and every week that I did not follow up produced 1 more week of the marriage, and the marriage was, in those weeks, the thing I was choosing when I chose not to open the file. A man who has been married twice, and who has experienced the specific damage that an ending produces, does not open a file quickly, even when he is a fraud examiner, and what I am most ashamed of is not that I opened it eventually, but that the shame of opening it, the knowledge of what the opening might confirm, was sufficient to delay me for 14 months, while I continued to share a dining table with a woman I was not examining. This is the cowardice I am not able to dress as something else. I began to notice things, which is not with alarm, but with the specific professional attention of a man who marks a file for follow-up. I want to be honest about what I did not do, because not doing it is the professional failure that I carry above everything else in this recording. I did not run the investigation when I first had cause to run it. A fraud examiner who notices a pattern of minor inconsistencies in a financial institution's books opens the file and begins collecting evidence systematically, using the tools available and applying them to the specific question the inconsistencies suggest. A fraud examiner who notices a pattern of minor inconsistencies in his own marriage tells himself that the evidence is ambiguous and that the threshold for investigation of a person you love is higher than the threshold for investigation of a financial institution, which is true, and which is also the specific rationalization that a man in my position produces when he is afraid of what an investigation will confirm. I knew what I was noticing. I was trained to know what patterns of minor inconsistencies suggest. I waited 14 months before opening the file. 14 months, in which the inconsistencies continued, and in which I continued to notice them, and to mark them for follow-up, and to not follow up, and in which Sirawan continued to be, in all the ways available to examination at the surface level of a marriage, a satisfactory wife. I want to add one thing about Sirawan's professional skills, and what they mean for the investigation's conclusions, because the connection is something the report names, and that this recording should also name. A hotel events manager who has spent 15 years in international hospitality in Bangkok has developed a specific set of capabilities, managing multiple simultaneous schedules, calibrating information given to different stakeholders, maintaining a consistent public presentation while managing a complex private reality. My profession calls this compartmentalization. Hospitality professionals develop it functionally because the job requires it. Whether Sirawan applied these capabilities deliberately or habitually is a question my report notes as unresolvable with the available evidence. What the report does establish is that the capabilities she had developed were directly applicable to the situation the evidence describes, and that their application produced a result that 30 years of fraud examination was unable to detect for 14 months. I was outperformed by a hotel events manager. The report says so. I will not revise it because it is accurate, and accuracy is the only standard I have. In September 2023, she told me she was going to Phuket for 2 weeks to see her sister, who was unwell. I had not met the sister. In 3 years of marriage, I had not met most of the people in Sirawan's Phuket life, which had registered as a curiosity rather than a concern, because Phuket is far from Bangkok, and our life was in Bangkok, and people who leave provincial lives for Bangkok careers often maintain a conscious distance from the provincial context. Her flight booking, which she showed me, was Bangkok to Phuket. Her hotel accommodation, which she mentioned she had sorted at a relative's, was consistent with the visit she described. She took 2 bags. She texted me from Suvarnabhumi. She texted me from Phuket. The texture of the first 4 days was entirely consistent with the Phuket visit she had described. I opened the file on day 5. I am going to describe what I did, and then I am going to describe what I found, and then I am going to describe what I produced, and then I am going to explain why none of it has changed anything. Let me first tell you what it felt like to open the file, because this is not an investigation I opened lightly, and I want the weight of it to be in the recording. On the first morning of the investigation, day 1, the 5th day after Sirawan had left for Phuket, I sat at the dining table with a coffee and a notebook, and I wrote at the top of the first page the standard opening entry of an investigation log. Date, subject, matter, objective, authorization. I had written that header approximately 400 times in 30 years, on behalf of the Crown, writing it on behalf of myself, about my wife, at a dining table in Bangkok, produced a feeling I had not anticipated and that I want to try to describe, because it does not have a clean name. It was not excitement, which is what junior investigators sometimes feel at the opening of a case. It was not the professional neutrality that 30 years of practice had given me for other people's cases. It was something closer to grief at the start, the grief of a man who has opened the file and knows that whatever the file contains, opening it cannot be undone. I wrote the header. I made a list of the available sources. I began. I am going to describe what I did, and then I am going to describe what I found. Phone record analysis. Applied to the records I could access. Social account examination, which required no technical skill beyond the specific patience of a person who knows that digital trails are produced by every interaction on any platform, and that patience is the main investigative tool for recovering them. Financial record review, using the statements and the access I had as a spouse to the shared accounts, and as a systematic man to the personal accounts, where the systematic habits of a 30-year career had, without design, produced a record I could read. Travel record verification, using the check-in systems available to a man with a working knowledge of what information is publicly accessible. And, on the 9th day, a visit to a street in Surat Thani that I had, through the phone record analysis, identified as a location Sirawan had been in consistently on dates she had told me she was elsewhere. I drove. I parked on the street. I waited for 40 minutes. I took 3 photographs. I drove back to Bangkok. I want to tell you about the drive back, because it is the part of the investigation that I have not been able to describe in the report, and that I am going to describe now. Surat Thani to Bangkok is approximately 600 kilometers and takes about 8 hours by road, and I made that drive alone, in a rental car, in the evening, arriving back at the apartment on Sukhumvit Soi 31 at approximately 2 in the morning. Sirawan had texted me from Phuket at about 7. Everything fine, sister doing better, how was I? I had replied, fine, had a day out of Bangkok, back home now. Which was true, and which omitted everything. Cross 600 kilometers of the road that runs north through Chumphan and Prachuap Khiri Khan and Hua Hin, and the Gulf Coast on the left side, and the dark bulk of the inland hills on the right. I thought about the photographs in my phone, and about the marriage, and about what the photographs meant for the marriage, and I will tell you what I concluded, which is nothing useful. At 2 in the morning, a fraud examiner has 3 photographs that provide evidential corroboration of a pattern established through prior record analysis, and a person has a marriage and does not know what to do with either, and the drive is 600 kilometers and does not resolve which of those 2 things is the appropriate frame. I parked underground. I went up in the lift. I made tea. I sat at the table. I did not look at the photographs again that night. I went to bed at 3. I got up at 7. And began day 10, and, on the 9th day, a visit to a street in Surat Thani. What I found, a second life. And before I describe it, I want to tell you what I was hoping to find, which is a thing a fraud examiner rarely admits. I was hoping to find nothing. I was hoping that 11 days of professional investigation would produce the specific outcome that most fraud investigations do not produce, which is an absence of evidence, and that the absence would allow me to close the file as unfounded and return to the dining table with a confidence I had been pretending to have for 14 months. Investigators who hope not to find what they are investigating are investigators whose judgment has been compromised by interest in the outcome, and we are trained to identify this condition in ourselves and to recuse if we find it. I did not recuse. I found what I found, which was the second life, and the finding of it was the worst professional outcome of my career, not because the evidence was insufficient. It was excellent, but because the result of excellent evidence in this case was not a prosecution or a referral or a client who could act on the report. The result was a 47-page document about my own marriage, sitting in a folder I open once a week. What I found, a second life. Not, as I want to be precise, a grand deception. Not a hidden marriage, or a fabricated identity, or a financial scheme directed specifically at me. A man in Surat Thani, who had been in Sirawan's life since before our marriage, who had not left it, and who had been managed within our marriage by a system of compartmentalization and schedule management that I recognize, with professional honesty, as genuinely skilled. The company registration documents that appear as Exhibit 7 in my report are for a small business registered in 2021 that lists Sirawan as a director, and that has, in its 2-year operating history, received 3 transfers from accounts whose source I was able to trace to the man in Surat Thani. The transfers total approximately 480,000 baht. For context on what 480,000 baht means in this structure, it is not a large amount. It is approximately £13,000 over 2 years, or about £500 a month. This is the contribution of a second relationship to someone's income, not the extraction of a primary income. I transferred considerably more than this into our household across the marriage. The shared rent, the shared expenses, the 2 trips to Europe in 2021 and 2022, the household furnishings, the medical costs. The 480,000 is significant, not for its size but for what it indicates, which is that the Surat Thani relationship was financially symmetric rather than dependent. She was not funding it from what I gave her. She had her own income from it. This is what the conclusions section calls a parallel financial arrangement, rather than a scheme directed at me. And the distinction matters for the question of what action is appropriate, and the action that is appropriate under a parallel financial arrangement is considerably less clear than the action that would be appropriate under a scheme, and the lack of clarity is part of what the recommendations section is contending with, and the recommendations section has been pending for 18 months. This is not the amount I had transferred into our household during the marriage, which was considerably larger. The $480,000 is the amount she received from him. I want to state that clearly, because it changes the shape of the story in ways I have spent 18 months working out. She was not extracting money from me to send to him. She was running two separate financial relationships in the normal way of two separate relationships. The money she received from him suggests that what she had was not a dependency, but an arrangement, and the arrangement had been running for at least 2 years before I discovered it, and had probably been running for longer. The 11 days of report production were the most technically proficient 11 days of my career, and the worst 11 days of my life. And those two things being true simultaneously is the specific condition of this recording. I found that the skills I had spent 30 years developing were exactly sufficient to produce a 47-page account of my own marriage's structure, complete with evidential exhibits, financial analysis, and a conclusions section that reads, in the professional register I have maintained across my career, as follows. The evidence indicates a sustained parallel relationship, predating and extending throughout the period of the marriage, characterized by active management of the subject's knowledge, and maintained through a pattern of scheduled compartmentalization. The recommendations section, which is the section of a fraud report that tells the instructing party what to do with the evidence, says, the matter should be referred to legal counsel for advice on the options available, including matrimonial separation, financial recovery where applicable, and any criminal complaint where the evidence meets the threshold. I wrote that section on day 11, at the dining table, at approximately 11 at night, and then I went to bed, and in the morning Sirawan returned from Phuket, and I made coffee, and she asked how I had been, and I said fine. Let me be specific about what she asked how I had been, and I said fine cost, because that exchange is the report's failure rendered in 4 words. The report is 47 pages of professional work that culminated in the recommendations section that I wrote at 11 at night, and the implementation of the recommendations began the following morning at 8:15, when Sirawan walked in, and the implementation lasted 4 words, and then it stopped. A man who has spent 30 years handing reports to prosecutors and watching them take action did not take action on his own report. The reasons I have given, the legal exposure, the inadmissibility, the cost of confrontation, the question of what comes after, are all real, and they are all rationalizations, and the rationalizations are the most honest thing I can offer you about the gap between professional knowledge and personal action. I know what the evidence says. I know what the recommendations say. I know that the recommendations require me to be willing to be alone again, and that being alone again is available to me, and is what my professional assessment says I should choose, and that knowing what you should choose and being willing to choose it are, at 67, after 3 marriages and 30 years of building cases for other people's courage, different things. The report is in the folder. The folder is on the laptop. The recommendations are pending. That is where this investigation is, and I do not know when it will close. Let me tell you, for the men watching who have the same professional background or who will be in the same situation with a different background, the evidence does not make the decision. This is not what they teach you in professional training, because professional training is about the evidence, and the decision is assumed to belong to the client. In this case, I am the client, and I am also the investigator, and the decision is mine, and the mineness of the decision is precisely what makes it undecidable by the evidence. Because the evidence tells you what happened, and the decision requires you to know what you want. And knowing what you want at 67, after 3 marriages and 30 years and a 47-page report, is the question that the professional training did not address. I want the marriage I had in 2021. I want the kitchen organized by someone who knows how kitchens should be organized. I want the quiet evenings. I want the 480,000 baht to not have moved, and the street in Surat Thani to not exist, and the 3 photographs to not be on my phone. None of those things is available. What is available is the folder, and the dinner, and the decision tree, with 4 branches, and 1 branch I have been on for 18 months, and the specific and accurate knowledge of what the other 3 branches contain, and Sirawan making dinner, which is good. The evidence is excellent. The case is inactive. The dinner is good, and I do not know what to do with any of that. And this recording is the only honest thing I can produce about the not knowing. A fraud examiner who closes a case without a determination writes in the final entry, "Case closed. Insufficient evidence to support further action." I cannot write that because the evidence is sufficient. A fraud examiner who closes a case with a positive finding and a set of recommendations writes, "Case closed. Matter referred to client for action." I cannot write that either because the client is me, and I have not acted, and the action remains available, and I go home to Sukhumvit Soi 31, and Sirawan makes dinner, and it is good. I have not shown her the report. I want to give you the 18 months since October 2023, because the recording should not end at the production of the report, and because the 18 months are what I am actually living. Sirawan came back from Phuket on the 19th of October 2023, 2 days after I completed the report. She came back at about 3 in the afternoon. I was at the dining table. She put her bags in the bedroom. She came into the kitchen and asked whether I had eaten, and I said not yet, and she made something, and we ate at the table where the report had been produced, on the laptop that contained it, and the laptop was open to a different page, and she did not ask what I was working on. That evening was the first of what are now approximately 540 evenings of the marriage as it is now, which is the marriage as it was before the report, available to me as a domestic life with a person whose company I find, still, genuinely preferable to the aloneness that preceded it, and that is the fact that the report cannot resolve. I tried, in November 2023, to consult with a lawyer. I rang a firm in Bangkok that specializes in matrimonial matters for foreign nationals, spoke with a solicitor for about 30 minutes, described the situation in general terms, without specifying how I had obtained the evidence, and received advice that was professionally appropriate and practically useless, which was, if you have evidence of a matrimonial breach and you wish to pursue a separation, the first step is to consult about the available grounds under Thai matrimonial law and to consider what claim you might have on the jointly held assets of the marriage. We had, at the point of the conversation, jointly held assets consisting of approximately £42,000 worth of furniture and electronics, and a marriage registration in Thailand that I could dissolve through the administrative process at the Amphor, which does not require a lawyer and does not produce any financial settlement. I thanked the solicitor and did not ring again. In January 2024, Sirawan's sister came to Bangkok. The sister exists. I met her for the first and only time over dinner at a restaurant on Thonglor. She is 4 years younger than Sirawan, works as a nurse in Phuket, and has a son at university in Chiang Mai. She and Sirawan talked in Thai for most of the dinner, and I sat with my red wine and my considerable knowledge of the situation and said almost nothing, and the dinner was perfectly pleasant, and the sister was entirely what she appeared to be, and I drove home and sat in the study for about an hour. What I do with the knowing is the question I have been sitting with for 18 months and that I have not answered. I have not answered it with action, which I have described. I have tried to answer it with analysis. I have, in fact, written 2 documents in addition to the report, which is the kind of thing a fraud examiner does when he does not know what to do with his evidence, which is to produce more documents about the evidence. The first is a personal impact statement, which is not a document that serves any legal purpose, but that mirrors the format of victim impact statements I have read across my career. It describes what the marriage was, what the evidence suggests about what the marriage was, and what the gap between those 2 descriptions means to me personally. The second is a decision tree, which is a standard analytical tool in complex investigations. You map the available decisions, the probable outcomes of each, and the consequences of each outcome, and you use the structure to identify the option that best serves the stated objective. I produced the decision tree in March 2024. The stated objective, in the document, is to achieve an outcome consistent with my long-term well-being and the accurate representation of the facts as established. The decision tree has 4 branches: confront, report to authorities, separate without confronting, or maintain the current state. All 4 branches produce outcomes I have analyzed. The branch I remain on, after 17 months of analysis, is the 4th. I have not shown her the report. I have not shown it to a lawyer. I have not separated, which I would know immediately how to do, and which I have not done, because the criminal threshold requires intent to deceive for financial gain, and the financial analysis in my report does not clearly establish that the 480,000 baht she received from the Surat Thani man constitutes financial gain extracted from me, because it does not. And I have not confronted her, because confronting her would require me to explain how I produced the evidence, and explaining how I produced the evidence would require me to account for accessing records I had no legal right to access, and the accessing of those records was, in the technical vocabulary of UK information law, a series of offences that I committed using skills paid for by the Crown, and I am not prepared to have that conversation with my wife or with anyone else. This is the recommendations section of the report left unimplemented, and this is the professional failure. I want to explain why, because the explanation is not as simple as cowardice, though cowardice is part of it. I have spent 30 years gathering evidence for other people's decisions. In a prosecution, the evidence is gathered for the Crown, which decides what to do with it. In private fraud work, the evidence is gathered for the client, who decides what to do with it. In this case, I gathered the evidence for myself, and the self who gathered it is a fraud examiner, and the self who has to decide what to do with it is a 67-year-old man who has been married twice before and who understands, from direct experience, that the decision to end a marriage requires something other than evidence. It requires the willingness to be alone again, and the willingness to be wrong in the specific way that a man is wrong when he destroys something that contained real things. Because the marriage contained real things. The coffee mornings and the private commentary on other people, and the cooking, and the specific texture of a domestic life shared with a person who is better at domestic life than you are, and the destroying of those real things on the basis of evidence that the man who found it cannot legally produce, is the decision I have not made. What I have instead is the report. 47 pages, 14 exhibits, a conclusion section, and a recommendations section that have been ignored by the only person in a position to act on them, which is me. In fraud examination, when a report is produced and its recommendations are not implemented, the case is filed as inactive pending review. That is where this case is, pending review. I open the folder approximately once a week. I read the executive summary. I note that the evidence is unchanged and that the situation is unchanged and that nothing I have read has produced any action on my part. And I close the folder, and I go back to the dining table where I produced it. And Sirawan makes dinner, and it is good, and we eat it, and the evening is what it is. I want to say something about why I am recording this. Because a man who has produced a 47-page confidential report and shown it to nobody has a specific relationship with disclosure, and the decision to speak into a camera at all requires some explanation. The reason is this. I have spent 30 years telling people what evidence is and what to do with it, and I find, at 67, that I am producing evidence I cannot distribute, and the not distributing is its own kind of professional failure, and the recording is the only form of distribution available to me in which no one is harmed by the distribution, not Sirawan, not me, not the man in Surat Thani, not any legal process. I am giving you the evidence without the exhibits. I am telling you the pattern without the source. The case is still inactive. The folder is still on the laptop. And if there is a man watching this who has the same professional background and who is in the same position, or who will find himself at a dining table in a country that is not his, producing the best work of his career about the worst thing that has happened to him, and who will wonder what to do with it, What I have for him is the only conclusion I have reached in 18 months of analysis. The evidence tells you what happened. It does not tell you who to be after. That is yours to determine, and it is not a professional question. And no format I know how to produce will resolve it for you. I have produced the best format I know. I have used it on the worst material available to me. The format is excellent. The material remains. I am going to close the laptop now and make tea. The evidence will be there when I open it. The dinner will be in approximately 40 minutes. The evening, as I have said, will be what it is. In 30 years of fraud examination, I never once produced a report and left it unacted upon. And this will be the first, and if there is a lesson in that, and this is the genre that ends with lessons, I will tell you the only one I have. The professional vocabulary is insufficient for the personal situation, and the professional who discovers this discovers it too late, and the too late is the condition, and the condition is what you manage, and the managing is what remains. I manage mine at a dining table in Bangkok, at approximately 6:30 in the evening, with a 47-page report in a folder, and a woman making something in the kitchen, and the something smells good, and I close the laptop, and I go.